Hey students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is the Transcontinental Railroad, Homesteaders, and Exodusters. And here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab and take some notes. So we're going to start by looking at this map of westward expansion that you saw in a previous video. You already learned about the first three events on the map: the Louisiana Purchase, the annexation of Texas, and the Mexican-American War. Each of those events added land to the US and helped fulfill the idea of manifest destiny. Today, we are going to focus on the last event on the map, number 4, and that is the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad did not add any new lands to the US, but it was a critical step in westward expansion because it allowed Americans to easily reach new lands in the West, which made it easier for them to settle there. Transcontinental means across the continent, and the Transcontinental Railroad was a 2,000-mile railroad that connected the east and west coasts of the United States. It was completed in 1869. Please notice that we are jumping ahead in time quite a bit here. The Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803, 65 years earlier, and the Mexican-American War happened in 1848, about 20 years earlier. So, by the time the Transcontinental Railroad was built in 1869, the U.S. had already added all the lands from coast to coast. And a critical event that happened before the Transcontinental Railroad, but that you won't learn about until the next unit, was the Civil War. The Civil War happened from 1861 to 1865, and it resulted in the abolition of slavery. So, by the time of the events that we're going to talk about today in this video, by the time those events happened, there was no more slavery in the US. And I want you to keep that in mind because it's going to be important later on in this video. Here is a map of railroads in the United States in 1870. As you can see, there are a lot of railroads over here in the east, but there's only one that's connecting all the way to the west coast, and that was the Transcontinental Railroad. So as this map shows, the railroad was a huge step in creating transportation between the east and west coast because before it was built, there was no way to get there, by railroad at least. Most of the men who built the Transcontinental Railroad were poor Irish immigrants and Chinese immigrants. In these pictures, you can see some of the Chinese immigrants who worked on the railroad. The workers faced terrible working conditions and low pay, and many of them even died while they were building it. Conditions were rough partly because the railroad crossed through areas of the US that were extremely difficult to work in. This is a picture of some land in the West. There's a lot of wide, open desert there. If you've never been to the West, you should try and go sometime in your life. The distances are vast. There's not a lot of people living there, and the landscape is beautiful. It looks nothing like New York, and you should really try and see it at some point. The Transcontinental Railroad also had to cross through the Rocky Mountains, which are a mountain range in the a mountain range that extends from the north to the south of the US in the west. So far in this class, you've only learned about the Appalachian Mountains, which are in the east. But compared to the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachians are like small hills. The tallest mountain in the Appalachians is about 6,000 feet tall, whereas the tallest mountain in the Rockies is over 14,000 feet tall. So imagine trying to build a railroad through these mountains. Another geographic feature I want you to know about today is called the Great Plains. The Great Plains is a large area of flat, grassy land that covers all these states shown in the map. Take a second and identify some states located in the Great Plains. Here's what the Great Plains look like. They are very grassy, with almost no trees. It's just a lot of grass. And before Western expansion, there were a lot of buffalo living on the Great Plains. These are buffalo that you see in the picture. There were also a lot of nomadic Native American tribes living on the Great Plains, and we call those tribes the Plains Indians. The Plains Indians include some tribes you might have heard of, like the Sioux and the Comanche. Buffalo were very important to the Plains Indians. They hunted buffalo, they used the buffalo skins to make teepees, they used the fur for clothing, and they used the meat for food. The Plains Indians were still living on the Great Plains well into the 1860s. That's a lot of time after the Cherokee and other tribes in the East had already been forced from their homelands and relocated to Indian Territory. But then the Transcontinental Railroad was built, and the railroad spelled the end of the buffalo and the decline of the Plains Indians. With the construction of the railroad, white Americans moved into the Great Plains, killed the buffalo, and took the land from Native Americans. By 1890, the Plains Indians had been defeated and forced onto reservations, just as the Cherokee had been 50 years earlier. Along with the Transcontinental Railroad, another event that led to more white settlers moving to the Great Plains was the passage of a law called the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was a law passed in 1862 that gave 160 acres of land on the Great Plains to anyone willing to live on the land for 5 years. This is a huge land giveaway. The US government just gave away land for free to anyone who'd agreed to live on it for a few years. And after 5 years, that land was theirs. Most of this land given away was on the Great Plains, and Americans who settled on the land were called homesteaders. Homesteaders. Most of the homesteaders were white immigrants recently arrived from European countries. A small number of homesteaders were African Americans who fled the South and moved to the Great Plains after the Civil War. And we call these African American homesteaders Exodusters. Exodusters. I want to repeat that the homesteaders and Exodusters moved to the Great Plains after the Civil War. So the Exodusters were not fleeing slavery, because by the end of the 1860s, the Civil War was over and slavery had been abolished. But even after the Civil War, there was still a lot of racism and oppression in the South. So some African Americans took advantage of the Homestead Act and moved to the Great Plains for more opportunities and more freedom. They're called Exodusters because of the two words exodus and dust. Exodus means a migration of people. That refers to the African Americans leaving the South. And dust comes from the fact that the Great Plains were really dusty. All right, let's recap. In 1862, the government passed the Homestead Act, which gave away land to people willing to settle on the Great Plains. People who took advantage of the law were called homesteaders, and most of them were white immigrants. But some homesteaders were black settlers who took advantage of the law in order to leave the South, and we call those people Exodusters. Both homesteaders and Exodusters settled on land that had recently been taken from Native Americans. Now it's time to review the objectives, and if you don't know the answer to any of them, just rewind the video and look again. I will see you in class. Bye, students.